Kashtira is the best deck of the new format, and you're probably trying to figure out how to beat it. Well, luckily, that's what you got me for. So, when we talk about Kashtira and how to beat it, you have to understand this is how we usually format these how to beat episodes as well. Is you have to first talk about what it's trying to do, because if you don't know what a deck is trying to do to win, then you can't really know how to beat it, because you can't beat something that you don't know what it's trying to do, right? So Kashtira is similar to a lot of other Yu-Gi-Oh based decks, like Thunder Dragon is similar to this, Orcus is similar to this. It is really less focused on comboing off and doing a lot of crazy cool combos, and more focused on control aspect, right? And now I know you might think of a Kashtira deck as a combo based deck, not a control based deck. But really, when we take a look at what a combo deck should look like, or a really big aggro summon a bunch of monsters deck should look like, it's not Kashtira. Kashtira does not really do that, right? And that's an important distinction to make, for a couple of reasons. One, cards like Nibiru, kind of Nibiru. Nibiru is not terrible against Kashtira, but cards like Nibiru, even a card like Summon Limit, card like Summon Breaker, right? Cards like that aren't necessarily great. They're not bad for sure, right? Any Yu-Gi-Oh deck in 2023 is going to summon a lot of cards, right? Like even like Sky Striker summons a lot during its turn, right? And that's a really big, even like Labyrinth, right? It's another good example of a control based deck. And Kashtira is no different. Now, if Kashtira is able to set up its board, it can appear to be like almost unbeatable because of the setup that it has. But because there's so much support for so many different things nowadays, it's actually not impossible to think that you could easily beat this with whatever deck you're playing if you have the right cards at the right time, right? Now, essentially what Kashtira is trying to do, they're trying to level 7 spam, right? To eventually rank 7 spam. And for those who are unaware, and I wanted to go to like this website just so we can look at different cards and different things like that. If we get rid of this filter and we go over here to Xyz and we go to 7, right? I think a lot of times when people think of like the best Xyz rank, they think of 4, they think of 8, maybe 3, sometimes even 2 because Sprite's annoying. But when we look at the rank 7 pool, where you have cards like, that was a bad example. That page was a bad example. But when you have cards like Mecha Fan of Beast Draco Sack, number 11 Big Eye, Galaxy Tomahawk is banned. That's a really good card as well. Even this card isn't terrible. When a card effect is activated that targets this face-up card, you attach it to the material and negate the activation if you do destroy one card in the field. That's not a terrible card. Number 89 Diablos is a really good card that we do see Kashtira running. This card isn't terrible, actually. In a Sylvan deck. But then, of course, Red Eyes is a really good card. This card is actually a decent card. It's an infinite permanence during your turn. And there's just actually a lot of really good rank 7 monsters. Not a lot, right? Not like an insane amount, but a good amount, especially considering that this deck is bringing some to the table, right? As I have the filters still on. So when we look at what Kashtira is trying to do, that's really the first thing they're trying to do. They're trying to access the rank 7 pool because most of their monsters are level 7s, right? Obviously, there's Rise Heart that likes to do its own thing. But for the most part, they're all level 7s, right? So now, when we look at that, we also have to see, like, what are the key different cards that help it control, right? So first of all is Kashtira Birth, right? You can normal summon, you can special summon. If your opponent activates a spell card, and you control a Kashtira monster, you can target up to 3 cards of your opponent's graveyard, banish them face down, right? Rise Heart also banishes the top 3 cards of an opponent's deck face down, right? So that sort of interaction point that we see like Runic and Tier Elements have with your deck Kashtira has that access to it as well, right? I'm pretty sure I haven't looked at Runic in a second. We can take a look at Runic in a second. I mean, obviously, Tier Element is that's kind of the way you could punish Tier Element, was that they would mill your cards and you would actually want them to. That's why the Tier Element mirror was so popular, right? And I'm pretty sure when it comes to Runic, Runic um, banishes face up, right? Whereas the Kashtira cards, a lot of them banish face down, right? And until something changes, I think it's like Cyframe Lord Omega, like there's really not a lot of ways to access cards that have been banished face down. And the other thing too about them being banished face down is meaning cards like Necrophase, cards like the Metaphys cards, right, which we'll talk about in a second, they don't get their effects because they're banished face down, right? So that is a bit of a nuisance as well. Another thing, just keep in mind about Big Bang. Big Bang's a pretty interesting trap card. They don't really see it too often, but it is an interesting one. What it can do is that if a Kashtira exceeds monster on the field, your player controls 2 or more monsters, they must banish monsters they control face down. So they only control 1 monster, and then it also surges. Attached to yeah. So this is I don't know if it searches, but anyway, it's not that great of a card, but it is a good enough card, right? To where it is something that you just need to be aware that it exists, right? And the fact of the matter is that, let's make sure we're not missing anything. We'll go to card text as well, see if something else comes up. The fact of the matter is that this deck is very consistent. See, I knew there was a field spell that also searched, right? But it also has the ability to, if Shangria, you control activates an effect, you can target 1 card in the field, destroy it, right? So, and Shangria activating its effect multiple times in a turn is kind of another big thing that the Kashtira deck is trying to do, which we'll get to in a second. But a big thing to remember about this archetype is cards like Fenrir as well. There's just a lot of different interaction points, which is why I say it is more of a control-based deck than a combo-based deck. It's like it's not trying to set up this crazy big board, right? It's trying to, that's, like, okay, I understand, like, a Borlo Salvage Dragon plus an Appaloosa plus the Heradic Link monster would appear to be like a control deck as well, but it's really not. Like, it's really just, once you get through all of the known negations, then you're good. What this deck is trying to do, this deck is trying to get you to play through this disruption. Now you have a new thing you have to worry about. That type of thing. So it is kind of a combo deck, but it's also really good at controlling the opponent out as well. Especially with the card, like we mentioned, Kashtira Shangri-La, right? And you know what this one does. Obviously, this is the one that starts taking away monster or spell and trap zones. Right? Now, an interesting thing to note right off the gate is it does say you can choose 1 unused monster spell and trap zone, right? So an interesting way to play around that is to start setting cards and putting cards on the board early. Like, obviously they're going to try to do it preemptively during their turn, try to snipe some of your cards. But really a good way to play around that is to start to take up those zones as quickly as possible, right? And then finally, and probably most importantly, is that this deck has a card that says, first off, Kashtira Arise Heart is very easy to come out, right? So once per turn, you can Xyz summon this card by using a Kashtira monster you control. If the Shangria, Ira, goodness gracious, if that was activated this turn, right? So if you're already missing a monster zone, this card can come down on a Kashtira Scareclaw card or whatever it's called, the Tier Element Kashtira, whatever, right? Or on a Fender. Then any card sent to the graveyard is banished, as said. And then once per chain, anytime a card is banished, attach it as material. You can attach up to 3 materials, target a card in the field, banish it. So that's an interaction point. And then while they're banishing it, they can also activate the Ira's effect to take a monster or spell a trap zone. So it might seem like, okay, there's no way to beat this deck, right? But like I said at the start of the video, as we're about 10 minutes in, every deck is relatively speaking beatable, right? So something worth noting, right, when it comes to Kashtira is that you have to play an archetype that isn't too resource dependent. And what I mean by that is an archetype like Tri Brigade, for example, that can play through multiple interruptions, right? Or even a deck like Sword Soul, kind of, not really. Tier elements, sort of. Sprite, kind of, even though they're not as good as they used to be, obviously. But they can play through multiple different forms of interruption, right? Floanderies can kind of be like that as well, with their quick play spell, with their field spell. Don't sleep on Floanderies just because Stormwinds was taken out, right? Because another thing that Floanderies does, I think, relatively well, is that it doesn't care about losing its monster zones, right? So the monsters with spell and trap, it has 2 monster zones left. That's really all Floanderies needs to get its combo going, is 2, right? And it is kind of hard for Kashtira to take up all the zones immediately. Like, obviously, if that happens, you're kind of SOL, but like, you can definitely, like, with 2 or 3 monster zones, there are a lot of decks that can still do a lot of things, right? And what's interesting to note too, it does say main monster zone, right? So take a look at deck like Adignister. Um, if you're able to put your big boss monster with like 4K in the extra deck monster zone, you're fine. Or even a deck like we just mentioned, like Sky Striker, right? Sky Striker, it's a little weird because they can obviously banish your engages face down, your multi rolls face down, different things like that. And this can obviously go against a spell and trap zones as well. But Sky Striker is interesting because it doesn't care. It almost wants its monster zones to be able to be unused, right? So Sky Striker is another interesting one. Now, if you're in a position where you're like, okay, well, I don't like playing Sky Striker, or I don't like playing, or I don't think it's going to be very good, or even if you are playing those decks, you still might find yourself in a situation where you have a tough time beating this archetype. So now let's take a look at good cards going first, and then good cards going second against this deck. So going first should be relatively obvious, but I'm just going to go ahead and say it anyway. There are a lot of cards with barrier in the name. Who would have guessed? Dimensional barrier, right? So Dimensional barrier has always been good, right? As someone who's been playing the game long enough to remember when this card came out, right? And it was a 7 Invasion Vengeance, 2006. Jeez, 7 years ago. Sorry, existential crisis. Anyway, as someone who was around then, I remember people were saying this card should get banned, and I remember a big reason why this card wasn't going to get banned was simply because it didn't say Link, right? And Konami has a tendency to, like, Baguska is another good example of, like, a card that hurts every single type of monster except one, Link. So not only is Konami like, no, we're not going to hit these cards that hinder you when you're playing other archetypes, but we're also going to essentially buff these archetype that we want you to play indirectly, right? And so D-Barrier has just been always floating around, waiting and waiting and waiting. It was like, about a year and a half ago when Sword Soul was the best deck in the room and everybody's playing D-Barrier again. D-Barrier is a relatively easy card to get a hold of too. That's what's great. I think the most expensive D-Barrier is 35, maybe. I don't know. Could be more. I know the cheapest ones are like $1 or $2, right? And that's assuming the worst case scenario. So D-Barrier Call Xyz. What's really great though too about D-Barrier is that it negates the effects of all monsters of that type as well, right? So it acts as a skill drain while also acting as essentially a Vanity's Emptiness, specifically for Xyz. And the thing is, Kashtira does a lot of times, like similar to Sword Soul, lock themselves into Xyz summoning, right? So you can take advantage of that with a card like Dimensional Barrier, right? Now, another big thing, as we try to go back to Kashtira, another big thing to remember when we take a look at Kashtira, a lot of their cards are psychic, right? They have a very important card that's a warrior and a very important card that's a machine, right? A lot of their cards are a bunch of different archetypes, right? which is why we've seen, and these cards always make their way. These cards always make their way. Is it Gozan? Must be Gozan. These cards, I don't know how to spell Gozan match. These cards always make their way though into side decks, into videos like these, where we talk about um, what to side, how to beat. I'm having a tough time finding this. Is it not match? Goes in match? Let's try this. Okay, let's just do this. Okay, because the biggest thing here is that in goes in match more than rivalry, um, is that they are completely locked out of what they're trying to do. I'm searching by card text. That was why. They're completely locked out because it says, well, each player can only control one attribute. Now, the unfortunate thing about goes in matches, we finally got to the card, is that you have to play a deck that can run goes in match, right? You have to play a deck that is only running Earth, or is only running Dark, or is only running Light. But there are a lot of archetypes that are like that. Now, Rivalry of the Warlords, people might look at and go, well, that's not very good. But it kind of is. Like, it kind of is because of the simple fact that two of the best cards are not psychic. Like, Fenrir is crazy, don't get me wrong, right? And it also can target that Rivalry of the Warlord that you have and get rid of it, right? But Riseheart is really good as well, right? It can really supplement. It can really supplement the play string that the Kashtira player is trying to get through, right? And then if you're able to lock your opponent out of something they're a Riseheart, now you don't have to worry about Macrocosmos, right? So you're essentially okay. Yeah, you're essentially saying by flipping up Rivalry of the Warlords, because some archetypes can't run goes in match, but they can run Rivalry, right? Some archetypes can run both, right? And like the more you can run of these type of floodgates going first, the better. But like I said, essentially you're saying I'm gonna flip up this card. You can summon most of your cards, but not the Macrocosmos, right? And so that's something that's really strong there as well. Um, there is another card that I've seen a lot that we'll talk about in a second when it comes to stopping the banishing. Don't forget, of course, I'm not gonna look it up because it's not that good of a card. But Imperial Iron Wall is a really good card. Artifact Lancia. I don't actually think that card's very good. That's an interesting thing. Well, we will talk about Artifact Lancia though for a quick second. The interesting thing about Lancia is that it's it says neither player can banish. It says during your opponent's turn, you contribute this card. Neither player can banish cards. Right? So it's only really during your opponent's turn. And that is kind of big, but it's not really big enough to where I think running a card like Artifact Lancia is good, right? And Artifact Lancia is not a going first card, which is what we're talking about right now, but it is just something to keep in mind. Another relatively interesting card to keep in mind, a card you may have already seen, because there's another archetype that really doesn't like this card. If I can even find it, I don't even think I can. I don't even think I know how this card is spelled. But there it is. Yes, it's the Stygian Dirge, right? And so once again, if you gotta remember, this is for going first, right? If your opponent hasn't even taken their turn yet, right? That means that they haven't activated the effect of Kashtira Shangri Ira, right? This card can only be summoned by using 2 plus level 7s, right? So I flip up Stygian Dirge. All their cards are level 6. And what's really cool about Stygian Dirge, if my opponent is, it goes against a lot of other decks as well. And so does D-Barrier, it goes in match rivalry, right? But what's really cool about Stygian Dirge is you just flip a face up and your opponent just almost really can't even play, right? Another card that we should mention going first should be fairly obvious, but in case it's not, is Skill Drain. I mean, like this card, one of the most appropriately named Yu-Gi-Oh cards of all time. Just completely shutting your opponent down. There aren't a lot of decks that could really run it and really run it well. Labyrinth is one of them. Which if you guys want me to do a video about talking about how to beat Labyrinth or any deck, please let me know in the comment section down below. It's just something to keep in mind. But as we move forward, let's just get these cards out the way, right? Book of Eclipse, this is for going second. Book of Eclipse, Book of Lunar Eclipse, even Book of Moon are huge, right? The interesting interaction with Arise Heart and a card like Dark Ruler No More, or Infinite Impermanence, or Forbidden Chalice, anything that turns off effects, right, is that the monster zones remain unused. And it's actually not Arise Heart that's doing it. It's Shangri Ira, if one of these days I'm going to say that card's name right. Because it's already doing it. It's already made those monster zones unusable, right? And so it's similar. This is the way I always remember it, right? There's a card, Ritual Beast, Tamer Elder. See if I got. See that one I just knew off the top of my head. It's because I like Ritual Beast though, right? This one says during your main phase, in addition to your normal summoner set, you can normal summon. After you normal summon this card, you can normal summon again, right? So you normal summon this card. Your opponent chains impermanence. But since the normal summon already happened, right? It's not an on summon effect, right? Since the normal summon already happened, it's now a part of the game state, right? So it's similar. It's not exactly like that, but it's similar to that, which is why cards like Book of Eclipse, Book of Lunar Eclipse, and Book of Moon are really, really solid. Another card, obviously, we've talked about these before. I'll just open that up real quick over there. Is a card like Lava Golem and a card like Winged Dragon of Ra, Sphere Mode. Now, do keep in mind, Lava Golem, Ring Dragon of Ra, Sphere Mode both say the exact same thing, which is you cannot normal summon or set during the turn you special summon this card. Now, a lot of decks don't care about that. We've seen like Floanderies, for example. They'll give your opponent a Lava Golem and activate the map, banish Eaglin, search Rabina, do Floanderies things, right? Not all decks can do that, right? But if your deck is able to support a Lava Golem or a Ring Dragon of Raw Sphere Mode, you could be in a really good spot. Another thing, too, though, to remember as far as going second is concerned, is just cards like Raigeki. Like Raigeki and Dark Hole and even Lightning Storm. Like, this deck has forms of disruption, but they're not running a lot of forms of disruption. In terms of like negation, I should say. They're running disruption, but not negation, right? So Raigeki, Dark Hole, different things like that. And then, of course, this card is really good in the mirror match. I did just want to bring it up real quick. Is Chaos Hunter, another card that randomly always sees play. We've actually talked about this before on the Market Watch, so I don't want to dive too deeply into that. But just saying your opponent cannot banish cards is super big, super huge. But what's interesting about Kashtira is that we've seen a lot of like Dark Law, for example, right? Dark Law, if it's like, let's say Dark Law was enemy controlled over to the opponent, it would really hurt heroes. Kashtira, though, doesn't really care about cards being banished. So you can't really run cards like Defissure or Dimensional Shifter against them because they don't really, like, they care, but they don't really care. And sometimes it actually even almost helps them out, right? Another card that's interesting, just something to keep in mind, is a card like, is this how you spell? That's not how you spell it. I don't even know what that is. Is a card like Ferret Flames, right? If the combined attack of all face-up monsters your opponent controls is higher than your life points, you can make your opponent shuffle monsters that you draw into their deck, except monsters 0 attack. So the combined attack remaining is less than or equal to your life points. And I know it's more of a going first card, but it's kind of like a later game card. It's just interesting like that. Just anything like compulsory evacuation device, anything that can get rid of Shangri Ira and Arise Heart. Those are your main two cards. If we go all the way back now to Kashtira, those are your main two issue cards that you need to be worried about. Arise Heart, the Walking Macrocosmos, that also is a once per turn banish face down, right? And then the Shangri Ira, which is going to be taking away your spell and trap zones or your monster zones. You are able to out those cards by however you can. You should be able to do well. do keep in mind, most of them have 3,000 attack or defense, right? Or both, or less, right? So if you are able to summon like a Super Quantum King Magnus, right? Or a Raid Raptor Ultimate Falcon, um, or we talked about the Adagnister monster, even like Clayport Towers. Um, that's weird. Clayport Towers does kind of counter this. But just anything that is just humongous, massive, and it's unaffected. That actually can be really good, right? That's what's interesting that's why I say this isn't really a combo deck, because it doesn't combo up and get into those bigger monsters. And this deck, because it's an Xyz based deck, I mean, obviously there's Zeus, right? And Zeus, I believe Zeus, because of the way, I think Zeus is a level 12, right? I don't know how to spell any cards in Yu-Gi-Oh. Z-E-U. Yeah, he's a rank 12, right? So if they are able to, they probably could just walk into towers. So maybe not. Maybe Towers Turbo shouldn't come back just quite yet. But you understand like what I'm trying to get at, though, right? Like cards that are like this, or like a better version of these cards, like Raid Raptor Ultimate Falcon. I'm having a tough time thinking about what exactly Kashtira could do to a Raid Raptor Ultimate Falcon. That's on the board alone. And that's the important thing to remember, too. Maybe they just stall you out and wait to find the out. I'm not sure. But I'm having a tough time. Just the card by itself. And you guys can let me know in the comments down below, Kashtira players, what are you going to do with a 6 different material, Super Quantum Great King Magnus? That's just on the board. Maybe it's our time, Super Quant players. But anyway, let me know what you guys think. What are some of the best cards that you can find to counter Kashtira? The different ways that you're trying to do. Like I said, they're trying to take cards from your extra deck. They're trying to banish all your cards, and they're trying to use your monster zones. So if you don't utilize your extra deck too much, if you don't really care too much about your monster zones, and you don't really care about your cards getting banished face down, right? You could just rely on the resources that you have. You could actually put yourself in a really, really, really good spot, right? I hope this helped you out. If it did, make sure you guys click that like button down below. Make sure you guys subscribe for even more Yu-Gi-Oh content. But most importantly of all, have a good day.